Thomas Ricks is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of several works, including Fiasco, The American Military Adventure in Iraq, and the novel A Soldier's Duty. He also writes for the website foreignpolicy.com and covered the U.S. military for the Washington Post from 2000 to 2008. In this dual biography, Ricks presents Winston Churchill and George Orwell as two of the 20th century's great freedom fighters, focusing on the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, a period when democracy was losing ground to the deceptive idealisms of communism and fascism. Ricks charts Churchill's rise from the failure at Gallipoli and Orwell's climb from obscurity, seeing both men as compelled to act, speak, and write in defense of human liberty and against all forms of authoritarianism. Kirkus Reviews called Churchill and Orwell a superb account of two men who set standards for defending liberal democracy that remain disturbingly out of reach. Please help me in welcoming Thomas Ricks.
A couple of my own notes to begin. 20 years ago, more than that, 30, 40 years ago, about 1983.
Bring the mic up.
Sorry, thank you. Can you all hear me in the cheap seats? Okay, I'll yell. In about 1983 or so, a friend of my wife and I's named Andy Morsand gave us, she always says he gave it to him, we'll ask him. She always says he gave it to her, I say he gave it to me. The collected essays, articles, and letters of George Orwell. And that was the origin of this book. And as it happens, Andy is standing over there right now. So Andy, here's a chair for you.
No, I like standing.
Andy,
I sit too much.
Okay. See, he's a generous guy even now. Andy, thank you for showing up. It's the first time I've ever had
Well, how could I not?
the grandfather of a book show up. I'm just taking a moment to look around because I think this is as close as I'll ever come to attending my own funeral. You know, you do a lot of book talks, but this is special at Politics and Prose. I see colleagues, old friends, old neighbors. So I hope I don't die while I'm talking. There are a lot of people here to acknowledge tonight in addition to Andy. A guy who's been kind of my strategic mentor, Elliot Cohen, also might be here. Elliot, you in the house? Oh, there you are. Good. Another origin of this book is Elliot is a professor at Johns Hopkins, has generously invited me along on a couple of staff rides when you go out on a battlefield and walk with people steeped in various aspects of it. And Elliot, several years ago, invited me on a staff ride of the Spanish Civil War. And since I was a journalist, then a war correspondent for the Washington Post, Elliot assigned me the role of George Orwell. And that planted another big seed for this book. And to Elliot's eternal credit or damnation, this is the second book that I've written inspired by one of his staff rides. My previous book, The Generals, was inspired by a staff ride that he invited me on of Sicily, which led to my book, The Generals, asking the question, why don't we demand accountability of our generals now as we did back in World War II? So thank you, Elliot. I've never begun a book talk before with acknowledgments so much, but I see somebody else back there, Karen Chenoweth. Karen really was an inspiration for the end of this book. The original ending stunk. According to my editor, the whole first draft stunk, but especially the ending. And Karen, in a series of emails back and forth, really helped me focus and think through what the ending of this book needed to say, which I really appreciate. Similarly, Tim Noah, who's sitting over there, standing over there. Tim, there's a seat. Tim Noah really helped me think through the ending and especially pointed me to Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail as something that was very much in the tradition that I was writing about in this book. So it's kind of amazing to see you all here. And finally, my wife and my daughter. And my acknowledgments I say at the end, thanks to my wife for sticking me on life's long journey. She's put up with a lot. So thank you, Mary Kay, and thank you, Molly. I just want to point out that almost all the people I've thanked here have books for sale here. Tim Noah wrote a great book on inequality. Karen Chenoweth has written several great books on what makes good high schools and other aspects of education. Elliot Cohen wrote Supreme Command, the best single book ever written about how to think about civilian leadership of the military. In some ways, I think my book, The Generals, is a gloss on his book, Supreme Command. If you haven't read it, you should. Are there any other friends' book? Oh, my wife wrote a great book about
Yes.
the escape on the Pearl.
Yes.
So all these people have written books. You should buy them. Anything I'm leaving out? Okay. Good. Okay. I'm going to try to talk for about 20 minutes and then get into your questions, which I think are the more interesting part of the event. Churchill and Orwell. I am fascinated by these two guys. It was such a pleasure for the last 3.5 years to wallow in the prose of Churchill and Orwell. They're very different. Orwell said that he wanted his writing to be as transparent as a window pane, to be clear and plain. Churchill, by contrast, though a politician, also made his life by writing, but his prose is elegant, ornate. If Churchill's prose were to be a window, it would be a stained glass window in a cathedral. In many ways, these guys are totally different. Even their flaws, and they had big flaws, are different. Yet, surprisingly, at an unsettled time of disequilibrium in international politics, not unlike our own time, they both looked around and came to minority conclusions at a time when the majority was saying either fascism or communist, your only choices. They actually said, hold on, time out, step back. We need to preserve liberty in an age of the intrusive state. Churchill was a conservative, an imperialist, a loudmouth extrovert, a bon vivant, and as we all know, a consumer of alcohol. Churchill once showed up for breakfast at the British Embassy in Cairo during World War II and asked his hostess for a carafe of white wine with his eggs. The ambassador's wife, a little bit shocked, raised her eyebrows. He said, don't worry, I've already had 2 whiskey sodas. Orwell came home one day during the war to find the dinner that his wife had nicely left for him on a plate. And there was also dinner for the cat. Absent-mindedly, he ate the cat's dinner and gave his own to the cat. It was boiled eels, by the way. They never met, but they admired each other from a distance. Churchill loved 1984 and read it twice. And of course, you remember the hero of 1984 is named Winston. And in the England of the 1940s, there was only one Winston. The other politicians were known by their last names, Chamberlain, Baldwin, Attlee. Winston was called Winston. Churchill was virtually the only conservative Orwell, a socialist, admired. And the last thing he ever wrote was a review of Volume 2 of Churchill's World War II memoirs. The crucial period for them, the fulcrum of this book, is the late 1930s and early 1940s. Churchill was a failure for most of his life, really with the exception of 1 year, 1940. And in that year, he saved the West. Not a bad year. They also, and this is really important, were willing to disagree with their own ideological allies. Churchill so much that he spent the 1930s in what he called the political wilderness. For most of that decade, he stood isolated and alienated from his own party. He was a well-known political leader, he was popular, but they would not have him in the Conservative Party's cabinet. Why? Because he insisted on a simple fact. Again and again, beginning in 1933, he stood up in the House of Commons and said, the great fact of today is that Germany is rearming. This was not something the conservatives wanted to hear. This conflicted with the official policy of appeasement. Appeasement was the smart move, they thought. It was the policy of the government. It was what the smart people thought was, let's negotiate with this guy Hitler. We can feed him little bits. We can stave him off. And anyways, nobody would go to war alongside us if there were a war, so this is the smart move. The general view was that Churchill in the 30s was washed up, finished, a bit of a joke. Yet, as they say, he persisted. And when England declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, he got up in the House of Commons and said these words: "This is a war to establish the rights of the individual. It is a war to establish and revive the stature of man." These were words that Orwell would endorse. By this point, of course, a lot of people had come to recognize that Churchill had been right about the Germans, that you could not feed them little bits and make them go away. And so he was invited back into the cabinet, and 9 months later, in the spring of 1940, he became prime minister. It was an extraordinary time. He was unpopular still within his own party. He got more applause from the Labour Party than from the Conservatives when he entered as prime minister. England believed it was on the verge of being invaded by the Germans. They had a code word, Cromwell, which meant invasion is imminent, landing on the beaches is imminent. And that code word actually was transmitted in September 1940 when it was believed that the invasion was imminent. Just a couple of weeks after he came into office, the Dunkirk retreat began, when they evacuated hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers off the beaches of France and Belgium, leaving behind an army's worth of tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, heavy machine guns, and other gear. The British Army substantially arrived back home in England, but it was weaponless. In the summer of 1940, the British Army had about a brigade's worth of fighting equipment. No way to win a war. Fortunately for them, they didn't need it because the war was taking place over their heads in the Battle of Britain. During that summer, thousands of German fighters and bomber aircraft were in the sky. And these were the months when, of course, Churchill delivered his greatest speeches, the ones that still live in our phrases that we're familiar with. Blood, sweat, and tears. Fight them on the beaches. This was their finest hour. Churchill's speeches, I would argue, are the equivalent of Orwell's essays. Not their most important work, but in some ways their most moving and enjoyable works. Orwell into the 1930s, pretty much a conventional leftist. He was a socialist with all that carried with it. Then he went off to Spain, ostensibly to observe the Civil War, late in 1936, but very quickly became a participant in the war. He fought alongside a small marginal splinter group of anarchist Trotskyites called POUM, and their initials POUM. He came back to Barcelona only to find that his group, POUM, was under attack from the Republican government of Spain, ostensibly the left-wing government, because the Soviets, who increasingly were running the Republican government, and especially its security apparatus, first wanted to get rid of anti-Stalinist leftists. Those were the first enemy. The NKVD, the predecessor of KGB, and probably Putin's grandfather, built a crematorium on the outskirts of Barcelona to dispose of the bodies of those they liquidated. Orwell, we now know from the KGB archives that were released after the fall of Soviet Union, Eventually, he and his wife were both indicted for Trotskyite deviationism and treason. I think the first one being more of a sin than the second. They fled in the mid-1937. They got out. Many of their friends did not, and died in jails run by the Spanish Communist Party. When Orwell got home, back to England, having been shot right through the throat, he picked up all the newspapers and read about the war he had just been in and just seen, both the fighting on the front lines and the street fighting of factional fighting in Barcelona. And this is what he wrote. And I want you to think about this when you think about the phrase fake news nowadays. This is Orwell. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing those lies, and eager intellectuals building superstructures over events that had never happened. Sound familiar? Orwell came home from Spain, still a committed leftist, but believing that communism and fascism had more in common with each other than they did with democracy. And if you were going to be a Democrat, you could not be a Stalinist or a fascist. After Spain, his mission in life was to write about the abuse of power on the basis of observed facts, to be skeptical of everything he read, especially when it came from those holding power. Finally, what they both did. In the middle of the 20th century, Churchill and Orwell grappled with the same great questions, and that's what this book is about. Hitler and fascism, Stalinism and communism, America's rise and the preemption of Britain. Now remember, back then, the world doesn't look like it does now to us. Orwell was an unknown figure most of his life. And back then, many intellectuals thought that the key to understanding the world was the thinking of Freud, that the key was how the human mind worked. Others thought that Marx had it right, that the key question was ownership of the means of production. Those views may seem funny now, like the Albigensian heresy or something, but back then they were widely held. Churchill and Orwell went a very different way. They recognized, as most of their peers did not, that the key question of their time was how to deal with the rise of the intrusive state, the all-seeing government. In other words, how do we preserve freedom? How do we preserve the realm of the individual? And to recognize that the basis of liberal democracy is free thinking, free expression, and free association. And that if you can't defend those things, you become an enemy of democracy. They responded to these problems with the same qualities and tools: their intellects, their confidence in their own judgment, even when those judgments were rebuked by their allies and their other contemporaries, and their extraordinary skill with words. And they steered by their principle, the democratic principles, and then developed a course of action by applying their principles to the observed known facts. And this is what I meant about Tim Noah and Karen Chenoweth helping me with. This leads directly to Martin Luther King in his writing the letter from Birmingham jail, which is at the conclusion of my book. King is operating directly in that tradition when he says, what are the facts of Birmingham? The facts of Birmingham are that it is the most segregated city in America. It is a city in which the black population is subjected to police violence to keep them from expressing themselves. I would argue that takes him right into the middle of the great traditions of Western civilization. And the one thing I want to read from the book is that very ending If you'll bear with me, it's a couple of paragraphs. In most places and most of the time, liberty is not a product of military action. Rather, it is something alive that grows or diminishes every day in how we think and communicate, how we treat each other in our public discourse, in what we value and reward as a society. We can all endeavor to do as Churchill and Orwell did and as Martin Luther King did in Birmingham. Pursue the facts of the matter, especially about our own country and about its past. For democracies to thrive, the majority must respect the rights of the minority to dissent loudly, and I would add, even when those views are repugnant, especially when those views are repugnant. It's not the majority that needs protections. It is the marginalized minority, and that may be a Nazi on the left, it may be a racist, it may be a Stalinist. I will defend equally the right of those people to speak, as long as they do not engage in violence. The accurate view almost always will be at first a minority position. Those in power will want to divert people from the hard facts of a given matter, whether in Russia, Syria, or here at home. For example, why did it take so long for white Americans to realize that our police often treat black Americans as an enemy to be intimidated, even today? Why do we allow political leaders who have none of Churchill's loyalty to tradition, to institutions, to call themselves conservatives? The struggle to see things as they are is perhaps the fundamental driver of Western civilization. There is a long but direct line from Aristotle and Archimedes to Locke, Hume, Mill, and Darwin, and from them, through Orwell and Churchill, to Martin Luther King in Birmingham. This is the agreement that objective reality exists, that people of goodwill can perceive it, and that other people will change their views when presented with the facts of the matter. Thank you very much. Okay, I believe you have to line up at the microphones. Sure. You have to ask questions, not give speeches. And so we're off to the races. Yes, please.
How did Churchill reconcile his view of individual liberty with his view of imperialism?
Do you all hear the question? Reconciling? Okay. The answer is he didn't. He saw imperialism as a beneficial force. He believed in the civilizing mission. He thought they were giving British institutions and education to poor, benighted walks. I want to make clear, these are two heroes of mine, but they're both human people. And in fact, I think their flaws are essential parts of their character, and even more, I think their flaws help them be who they are. Orwell is a rather dank figure, kind of isolated, introverted, bit of a crank. Not somebody I think I particularly would enjoy having dinner with. I think he also, the great puzzle, or he was an anti-Semite too. Kept it through most of his life, even when he objected to other forms of British anti-Semitism, still kept it up. Orwell on women is creepy. Churchill had his own series of flaws as well. But he was a man of his own time. He was for the empire, thought it was a good thing, and saw no reason to reconcile it. Orwell, by contrast, saw the empire as a system of violent extraction of wealth and labor. Yet went off and became a policeman in Burma, which I still can't figure out. I think he had been so bullied in high school that he wanted to find out what it was like to hold power. But a creepy guy sometimes. Fascinating figures. And I think it was their very flaws. It was Orwell's fascination with power and abuse of power, I think, that enabled him to write a book like 1984. Yes, please.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks for a really great presentation. Stimulated a lot of interest for me. And especially, and early on, you mentioned that there are things in the Churchill Orwell story of the 30s and 40s that sort of resonate today because of, kind of political, geopolitical situation. So I was wondering if you would, you've done a little bit of this already, but if you would try to relate the situation then, and using the words or drawing the lines between what fascism and communism meant to Churchill and Orwell, and what today liberal and conservative, but also libertarian and socialist and populist. How can you use those words? And if you want to, if you can identify any Churchills or Orwells in our midst now, I'd appreciate that too. So.
I think the two great events in American history were the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, because both redeemed a country that was built on slave labor and the extermination of a native population. The Civil War was part redemption for that. The Civil Rights Movement was another part redemption for that. But we have a long way to go. And what's bothered me about this country is in the last 20 years, it seems to be going backward, not forward. Tim Noah on inequality. He can sign that book for you fellas. It's funny, somebody asked me today, who are the American equivalents of Churchill and Orwell? If I wrote a dual biography of Americans, who would it be? And I said Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin.
Bayard Rustin?
Yeah.
Yes.
They're two fascinating figures. I mean, Rustin is such a complex and interesting figure. Played a role first in the Civil Rights Movement and then the Gay Liberation Movement. Just an interesting figure in the work he does on King. So the question is, will we see other people like that emerge? I think the key is keep your eye on people who are willing to blow the whistle on their own side. Without naming names, I think some of the most interesting political thinking going on in this country right now is from conservatives who oppose Trump. These are people who have a good feeling for conservatism, better than I ever will, who are writing with great feeling and emotion and understanding about things like the Constitution, the rule of law, and what you do when you have a president who seems not only profoundly ignorant, but unfamiliar with the Constitution and the way this country is supposed to work. I would look for people who support institutions. We have seen the judiciary rise to the occasion recently. We have not seen the Congress rise to the occasion. And so I would look for people who speak out for rule of law, Constitution, and are willing to disagree with their own party. McCain and his mini-me, Lindsey Graham, do that a little bit, but McCain doesn't seem to have taken the full plunge, and I don't know why. I think it's because he wants somebody behind him. Otherwise, he's just McCain the Maverick. So I'm puzzled why people like one of my own senators, Susan Collins, another Republican, hasn't stepped up at all, and her silence is beginning to deafen me.
Sounds like David Brooks would fit your description.
I don't know. He's every liberal's favorite conservative.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
I had the good fortune to hear your complete interview with Terry Gross yesterday.
Isn't she a great interviewer?
Yes, she is.
I come out for the interviews with her, like, learning about interviewing every time.
Mm-hmm. My question is, do you think Hitler and Orwell would their attitudes toward Nazism and Stalinism, do you think they'd have...
You mean Churchill and Orwell?
Churchill and Orwell.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Do you think they'd have the same attitude toward Islam or Islamism today? Both the violent version and the politically aggressive version. I think they would.
Churchill on Islam is funny. He was in Saudi Arabia during the war, and it had been explained to him that you're not supposed to smoke or drink in front of the king. And he said, "But Your Highness," holding up his drink and his cigar, "to me these are religious sacraments."
I read what he said in 1900.
I think Churchill would take an imperialist view. You know, he was all in his younger years, he had a good role in messing up the Middle East. Orwell was very wary of nationalism and extremism in any form, and I think he would question Islamic extremist leaders' insistence on killing people who disagreed with them. He had a real problem with that. Yes, please.
Hi, Tom. You answered part of my question, but my question is based on essays written by Christopher Hitchens, who was a great fan of Orwell, in which he pointed out that he did struggle with his anti-Semitism, which you just hit on, but he didn't struggle with his anti-gay feelings, in which he called W.H. Auden a pansy, and the gay left, he called them Nancy boys. He didn't have any problem with that. And you say he was creepy, and I think he is. And would he be allowed right now to speak at Berkeley under the conditions that I just mentioned?
I think Orwell grew. He constantly re-examined his own views, and that's why the anti-Semitism puzzles me so much, because he didn't. On gays, he did write some nasty stuff. He was politically motivated at that time. He was very angry at Auden for leaving England and coming to America. He thought it was cowardly.
Yes, he did.
And he also had come across people like Guy Burgess and Raymond Mortimer. And he was running into some problem with these people who we now know were Soviet spies, who were tripping him up in his own work. For example, Peter Smollett was a British official, we now know also to have been working for the Soviets, who advised British publishers not to publish Animal Farm. So there was a real anger developing there. And there was a term for this sort of the gay spies. And I've seen him, I saw him use it somewhere. Maybe you remember it. It's eluding me. Probably better than it does. I think he would have changed. I mean, the great question is, would he have become a conservative? I think he was a traditionalist, but a traditionalist leftist. He explains in a passage I was thinking about today that his favorite British institutions that he thought were the most important were the pub, the playing field, and things, the church. He said unofficial, outside the realm of government. And that's what he really believed in.
Do you think he'd be allowed to speak at Berkeley?
I'll have to think on it, but you've already had a
Okay,
question.
so.
Yes, please. Well, how are we doing on time, by the way? I know a lot of people here are hungry.
I do have a question, but I must respond to it. I am from Maine also, and have had desperate hopes for Susan Collins. She's spoken out a couple of times, but not nearly enough. My question, well, they say something to the effect of war is the enemy of the truth.
Truth is the first casualty, is the old saying.
That's it. And I wasn't sure how you were tying these two together, and I thought you said, well, their pursuit of facts, but I mean, Churchill was yes, he may have had forebodings before the war, but certainly during the war, he sanctioned all sorts of lies about how battles were going, and mainly a cheerleader. Okay. And
no, he was not. Let me answer that. Churchill was not a cheerleader for the war. He ran that war and ran it extremely well. One thing he was very good at was telling his generals when they were wrong and encouraging and pushing them to take more risk. They hated it. They said, no, leave the war to the military. Again, I got to refer to Elliot Cohen, who's got some very good stuff on how Churchill ran the war, reaching down into the middle of the government and pulling out minute information and saying, you said this, but I see this. Something that Elliot, to his discredit, doesn't mention is that before the invasion of Sicily, he was told it would take a certain number of weeks to get ready. And he sat down and spent an afternoon at the Casablanca conference going through all the logistical and planning assumptions and cut 3 weeks and said, you can invade by mid-July. I think it was July 10th. And they all hated this, the generals. And they went back muttering, calling him, a madman and stuff. But again and again, he was more right than they were. He was wrong about some big things. The Anzio landings, which he supported, his opposition to Operation Dragoon, the landings in southern France that were very important logistically. But he was more right than he was wrong.
I can't resist, though, one further quote where he said, "History will treat me kindly because I intend to write it."
And he did. I actually write about this in the book. Part of the problem of writing about Churchill and having Orwell also on stage is Churchill just comes marching back and forth like a brass band through the book. In fact, somebody once complained that arguing with Winston in the cabinet is like arguing with a brass band. He's just pumping away there. He's giving the speeches, then he is writing the history. So I have a section of the book about his memoirs. The whole good books have been written on the memoirs. They do have big omissions in them, and they have some sins of commission in them. They actually have a little plagiarism in them from Samuel Eliot Morison. But they're great books, and it's the only account we have of World War II by one of the leaders of the war. It's a little bit like reading Agamemnon's account of the Trojan War. Okay, we're going to go to twofers here. I don't mean the character in the show. I mean fast questions.
Sorry, I was curious to what extent Churchill and Orwell aligned or diverged as to war aims, whether they were, relatively close or far apart in the strategy.
Orwell comes and goes in his views of the war. Early on, he thought it would develop into a revolutionary situation. Then, by the end of the war, he admits and he says, I was wrong about that. Interestingly, it actually was a kind of revolutionary situation. Churchill is voted out by the British people before the war ends in the Pacific. And a Labour government that introduces the welfare state is voted in. A soft version of a revolution, but nonetheless a social revolution. On war aims, the one thing they were in agreement on, and this goes a little bit to the previous question, they entirely agreed that a nation under threat of survival is entitled to do anything it needs to do to survive. Lie, kill, sabotage. So, for example, Churchill imprisoned the British fascist leader, Mosley, without trial. And then 3 years later, when it was clear because they were worried that if the Germans invaded, Mosley would be made the figurehead leader of England. 3 years later, Churchill let him go, saying if there's no reason to hold him, if he's just a harmless guy at this point, then it would be immoral for us to keep holding him. In both cases, Orwell applauded those moves, the imprisonment and the release.
Hi, Tom. I'm Matt Collins. I write for your blog sometimes.
Yes, thank you. As Tim likes to say, we give people exposure. Did you hear about the freelance writer who died of exposure?
So we remain a nation at war, and we both know good, honest, decent people that are working in the administration, probably out of sense of duty, and are in a difficult position, walked into a difficult position, and are in an increasingly untenable position. My question to you is, if they were here right now, what advice would you give them, and at what point do you walk away?
It's a great question. I do have some friends in the Trump administration, all on the national security side. And some of them did call me before they accepted jobs. Said, what do you think? And I said, it's really hard. On domestic side, I say never work for Trump. But my view back then in December was, we all know people who are still in uniform. They just can't take off their uniforms. If there's anything we can do to restrain the incompetence and madness of Trump and the people around him, it's probably a good thing to do to go into government. I've got to tell you, though, in the last couple of weeks, I begin to doubt that. When I watch H.R. McMaster get up there and quibble and mislead, I thought he's not doing himself any good. His job is to help protect the country, not to speak for and protect the president. And all he may be doing is enabling a madman. And it really worries me. I think McMaster thinks he is doing the right thing, which is keeping a lid on it, keeping policy going, restraining the crazies around him. And that if he stepped down, Bannon and the people around him would pick some yahoo. And that's what you don't want. I'm not sure on this yet, but I'm beginning to think, let 1,000 reactionaries bloom. let this administration just go, okay, American people, you bought it, you keep it. Let's see the really ugly face of this. And so I'm beginning to think maybe you shouldn't be in the government. On the other hand, I'm also beginning to think that a nuclear attack on North Korea is more likely than not in the next 12 months. So, you tell me. Okay. Well, let's make this the last question. I'm getting hungry, even if you aren't.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Ron Dennis from Florida. If Churchill were alive today, what do you think he would think of nuclear proliferation in Iran and North Korea with respect to the rearming of Germany?
What was it Germany at the end?
Yeah, look at how he thought about the rearming of Germany, how he responded to that. If he were alive today, how would he be responding to nuclear proliferation in Iran and North Korea? Would he take a similar approach or different approach? Or with his knowledge of history and geopolitics, where do you think he would go?
I would not accuse the Obama administration of appeasement of Iran for this reason. Chamberlain and the people around him negotiated with Hitler from a position of weakness. The United States negotiates with Iran from a position of strength. I'm confident that within about 3 weeks, the U.S. military, through airstrikes and other actions, could strip Iran of almost all its conventional military power. Now, you could still have a lot of guerrilla raids, attacks outside Iran, but we negotiate with Iran from a position of strength. And I think it's a good thing to get an agreement and to keep it. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out.